Welcome and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Kubiak and I'm a professor of practice at ASU, where I serve as the Director of Future Security Education in ASU's Future Security Initiative. The educational offerings I help guide include the practitioner-oriented MA in Global Security, or MAGS. The MAGS also has a non-technical concentration in cybersecurity, led by our guest speaker tonight, and a soon-to-launch concentration in irregular warfare. Additionally, we offer a graduate certificate in global security and competitive statecraft, and we are building a new portfolio of short courses in similar topics to be offered in ASU's career and professional development education outlet, Career Catalyst. Tonight's event is one in a series of events we run each fall and spring semesters to highlight the thought-leading security practitioner faculty that teach in our programs. Tonight's presenter is Professor Bob Schmidle. Professor Schmidle wears a multitude of hats. Most importantly to us, he is a professor of practice in the Future Security Initiative and the School of Politics and Global Studies, and teaches the overview of cybersecurity and cybersecurity planning and strategy courses in our cybersecurity concentration. Professor Schmidle is a retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant General. While on active duty, he served as the first Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command and served as the head of the Marine Corps Aviation. Professor Schmidle serves as University President's advisor on cyber capabilities and conflict studies and is active in a number of defense-related enterprises. As you would expect from any Marine Corps three-star general, I suppose, Professor Schmidle also has a PhD in philosophy from Georgetown. His discussion this evening springs from interesting work he is doing as part of a funded research project on Chinese cognitive warfare. The title is Countering Chinese Cognitive Warfare. What is cognitive warfare? How are the Chinese deploying it? And how best to counter it? Professor Schmidle will talk for about 25 or 35 minutes or longer if his interest, if his slides carrying him forward. And then we'll go from there. We'll go, feel free to ask questions along the way, throw questions in the Q&A block, and or at the end of the session, we'll try to get some of those answered. So without further ado, Professor Schmidle, thank you.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Jeff. It's great to be here with you all tonight. Just to kind of double tap one of the things that Jeff just mentioned, if you do have a question, you want to put it in the block, and I'm happy to answer them as I go. There's no foregone conclusion on my part that I'm going to get through this entire thing. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a project that's been ongoing for the last 2 years, which I just completed on cognitive warfare. And the project comes from a grant, and the purpose of the project was to do a couple things. One, to try to define what cognitive warfare is. In the last 4 to 5 years, there's been a lot written about it, a lot of it, quite frankly, on the part of the Chinese, which is what we're going to focus on tonight. But to try to define cognitive warfare, and then in the context of cognitive warfare, to give you an overview of the way the U.S. strategically looks at warfare and the way the Chinese do, and to sort of compare and contrast the two of them to see what vulnerabilities there may be and what opportunities there may be in terms of cognitive warfare, in terms of executing cognitive warfare. So to begin with, this is not something new. War has always been about this domain. This is its true nature. And for those of you that are familiar, Clausewitz, who is the preeminent Western philosopher on war, he wrote a book called On War. Clausewitz was on Napoleon's staff as well as on the Prussian general's staff. And one of the analogies he uses is that the two combatants in a war are like wrestlers. And what I would suggest is if you look at the history of warfare, you'll find that those that are the strongest don't always win, but the one that has the strongest will does. So cognitive warfare, again, is all about that. It's not about counting the number of tanks, the number of ships, the number of airplanes. It's about will and the will to fight. The quote-unquote cognitive revolution in warfare, as some people are beginning to talk about it, recognizes the fact that technology plays a role in shaping perceptions because it allows you to manipulate context. And context is really important because the way that we interpret events is determined by the context in which we put those events, the historical context in which we put them. It's not necessarily the data itself as much as it is the context. Important to remember as we talk through tonight is that technology influences those perceptions, but it does not determine them, okay? both existing and aspirational technologies are integrated into the operational concept. So an operational concept that the United States and the Chinese have is what informs the way we look at warfare. And that's what we mean by an operational context or concept. So again, back to the cognitive domain. The battlefield, if you will, of cognitive warfare is the human function of perception. And it has to do with understanding how we create beliefs, our belief systems. And those may or may not have anything to do with the facts. And as a matter of fact, in many cases, the facts are actually separate from the belief systems that individuals and that countries will act on. Okay. As an example, two countries look at the same set of facts about troop movements, and so as an example, in Russia, at the beginning of what was Operation Barbarossa, which was the German invasion of Russia, Stalin is given all the intelligence that you can possibly imagine that shows exactly where the troop movements are, how the Germans are coming closer and closer to the border. They're obviously preparing to attack, and Stalin chooses to believe something different and not to act on that. So that's when we talk about belief systems, that's kind of where I'm going with that. This is if you think about this domain, it's a fight for perception on both the part of the friendly and the enemy targets. Right. So we've begun to think about domains in warfare. We have a land domain, a sea domain, an air domain. We have a man-made domain called cyber. But this cognitive domain, the fight here is over perceptions. And again, a perception is something that is difficult to put your hands on, to touch, to feel. And it cannot be sort of sensed a priori. In other words, you can't look at an adversary and say, well, I think he believes that. The only way that you can really determine those belief systems and identify them is through the actions and behaviors of the target audience. So in other words, the cognitive warfare takes as its goal to change the perceptions, obviously, but ultimately to change the actions and behaviors of the target audience, and to do that through not necessarily through physical coercion, but through a change in the way we look at or think about this particular domain. So to start with, I'm going to define the cognitive warfare. And this definition comes from the People's Liberation Army, the PLA Daily. It's a publication in China that is usually, this is where the party will roll out, if you will, new concepts, new ways of thinking, and gauge the reaction to that, whether or not it's a positive or a negative reaction, which will have a great deal to do with how, moving forward, whether or not the government, G, is going to accept that. So this is very recent. It was about 8 months ago that they published this definition. This is the way the Chinese view cognition, view this cognitive domain operations. They talk about cognition as this process, right? That people acquire, process, and apply information, okay? And their operations, you can see the language in here. They take the human brain as a combat space, okay? And they focus on weakening and dismantling the enemy's will to fight, which is, again, back to Clausewitz and what he wrote about in the early part of the 19th century. And the Chinese, their sort of major political or theoretical thinker, Sun Tzu, who wrote, depending on whether you believe it was an individual person or not, 1,000 years prior to that, talked about the acme, if you will, of a general was to be able to win without fighting. And that's what is influencing the way the Chinese are viewing these operations, that it's to break the will of the enemy, that when they no longer have the will to fight, then the Chinese will have achieved victory.
Bob, we had a
If you look
question
at our,
we had a question in the question and answer block real quick, and I thought maybe this would be a good time to interrupt you because the question asks for kind of a clarification. You're familiar with Professor Ajit Maan, who teaches in our program and is part of the Weaponized Narrative Project. She uses the phrase or the terminology narrative conflict. She's a narrative scholar. She uses the term narrative conflict or narrative strategies in her work. How can you distinguish between the two? Do they overlap? I mean, how does narrative conflict and cognitive warfare relate to each other? Is there something useful that we can say there?
well, I think that the biggest, and I'm somewhat familiar with her work, but I think the biggest thing is that the cognitive warfare goes beyond narrative. Narrative, the language that we use, is a way of getting across a particular point. Language actually is what creates the world in which the belligerents live and operate. There's a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is an Austrian philosopher who wrote in the 20th century. And one of the things that he wrote about was language. And he very famously said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. So we can't. And then he went on to say at the end of that book, called the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, that what we cannot speak about, we must pass over. So what that is, what Wittgenstein was on, was this notion that language, if we can't express it in language, then it's not part of my world, so to speak. What cognitive warfare does is takes that and goes the next step and says, that's fine, and narratives may in fact influence, but they may not. A narrative itself is not enough to influence someone to break their will. It contributes to it, but it is not the determining factor.
Excellent. That's really good. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay. So here's where we're going to start to focus in on China and exactly what the Chinese do. So there's a number of ways to look at this, but the Chinese have a strategy, a strategic culture called Xi. And I will go into detail later on about what the US strategy is. But a Xi strategy fundamentally seeks to attack the enemy's strategy. And that's important for a very fundamental reason, because it doesn't seek to attack the enemy's forces. It seeks to attack his strategy. And as you can read on there, the object is to compel the enemy to acknowledge the dominance of the PRC and act accordingly. So you can see right now that one of the strategic pillars of the US involvement in the Pacific is building allies. And we have partners, we have allies, we have treaty allies, we have partners. And so the way the Chinese are going about trying to attack that strategy is, for instance, by pressuring the Philippines and trying to get the Philippines to acknowledge the fact that the Chinese are the stronger military in that particular regime and that they should act accordingly. Okay. The next bullet there, it talks about a fait accompli. So a fait accompli strategy has actually been applied for about 4 to 5 years now. The Chinese are calling it that themselves, as are Western observers. And here's an example of a fait accompli strategy. The Chinese occupy a rock in the South China Sea. They build, I mean, this happened recently. They build an airstrip on it and they begin to put military forces on it. They're doing that. The Chinese are doing that in the belief that we, the US, will not go to war over that. We will see that as that the risk is not, quote, worth it for us to go to war, to confront the Chinese over a rock in the South China Sea. Now, that is also based on the Chinese view looking at the last 70 years of US foreign policy, and realize that we have, in those 70 years, on numerous occasions, fought to a draw. We did it in Korea, we did it in Vietnam, we did it in Iraq, we did it in Afghanistan, and possibly not even to a draw, that we actually sort of gave up after a fashion. So they're betting on the fact that we are going to do that we are going to make the determination that trying to get that back, get that territory back, is not worth a full-scale war or the possibility of it. the Xi strategy that I've got written down here on the last thing. So Mao, there's a couple of things that these incidents have in common. So in the Korean War, when he, in October 1950, when he quote unquote suddenly sent thousands of Chinese communist soldiers streaming across the border into Korea, the ultimate goal of that was to pressure the United States, was to cement the Chinese, the view of China as a major regional power. Now, those forces that went across the border and they were tactically defeated. They were annihilated by the U.S. and they sent them in without any winter clothing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Mao was willing to accept a tactical military defeat in order to gain what he was trying to do strategically, which is to be seen as a power in the region. The Sino-Indian War, 1962, the Indians are being supported by the Soviet Union. And at that point, China and the Soviet Union are their relationship is beginning to fray. So Mao, again, in that particular war, tactically, he's defeated on the ground, but strategically, it cements his position again as a player in his mind of equal stature with the Soviet Union. And the Vietnamese War, 1979, the Chinese are going to stream across the border into Vietnam, and the Vietnamese are just going to stop them and attrit a large number of the forces. And Mao is simply going to leave. And so, again, when you think about the relationship between a tactical victory and a strategic victory, that's what is driving the strategy that is driving this way of looking at warfare. Again, so just to round this up, the Xi strategy is attacking the enemy's strategy, destroying the confidence that it can achieve its strategic objectives. It's a very classic kind of counterinsurgency that has been used against the United States in a number of places. The keys to success are these. They're not, by their own definition, the Chinese are not necessarily focused on changing the data. What they're trying to do is change our perception of the data. And again, the test of the strategy is not so much what is known by the adversary about us, but what we can do to turn that to an advantage. Deception plays a very, very large role in anything that the DRC does. But it's beyond just false information here. It's playing I come back to this notion of perception. Surprise in this strategy, in this strategic view, depends on prior perception by manipulating context. So if you look at the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when the Egyptians came across the Suez Canal, Sadat, the president of Egypt, we know now, he knew that tactically he could not stand toe-to-toe with the Israelis, but he wanted to push across the canal. He wanted to bloody the nose of the Israelis to prove that the Egyptians were in fact a regional power to be contended with. Deception and manipulating context, all the things that Sadat did, played to the Israeli belief that their defense forces couldn't be defeated tactically. So, and again, this notion of battle space and war space, the battle space is what we see militarily. The war space is everything else. So
let me interrupt again real quick. I'm gonna keep popping in, Bob, when we get questions in the Q&A block, because I want the audience to stay engaged, and they are. Another really good question comes from a member of the audience, and it says, so what do we believe or understand to be the target audience of these efforts then? Is it the political class, the civilian support base, enlisted officers, or all of the above, or some fashion of those?
So I believe what we understand of the way the Chinese, what they're writing about, and what we see them doing in social media networks and other places, is that their goal is to cause the United States, the people, the political body, to doubt whether or not its quote, worth the effort to confront the Chinese. And so their target audience is the U.S. domestic audience as well as the U.S. military. And they learned a very, very good lesson. They considered a good lesson, but a strong lesson from the Vietnamese. So in 1968, there was in Vietnam, in the early 1968, the American public, through television, radio, newspapers, was there. The writings about the reporting on the Vietnam War was very positive. We were making, they were using the body count, or we were killing these people left and right. We occupy all this territory, and then the Vietnamese, during the Tet, which was a religious holiday, had an offensive, and the next thing you know, there were pictures on TV while people were sitting or eating dinner watching their nightly news, because then the news just came out at a certain time, and they're watching Vietnamese soldiers running through Saigon, and they said, how can this be? So we now know that the Vietnamese, that their intent was to do two things during Tet. One was the dominance of the North Vietnamese army over the Viet Cong, which were the insurgents in the South, to establish that, but also predominantly to help create doubt in the minds of the U.S. public that this was worth the blood and treasure to do it. So I would say that their strategy is mostly focused on this cognitive war strategy, is mostly focused beyond the military level towards the political level and towards the people, if you will, of the United States, and what we would consider to be, quote, public opinion.
Yeah, good. All right, I've got another question in the Q&A block, but I think I'll hold it because I think you get to this later in your presentation. So I'll be back. I'll pop up again here in a little bit when I think this question fits into your talk.
So our current strategy would be characterized as Li in Chinese, which attacks the enemy's forces. And the assumption there is that if the enemy's military is defeated, then the political side of the enemy will know they're defeated and stop fighting. That's the strategic logic of the United States. And you can see it in the most classic example of this is during the Second World War, when General Eisenhower is getting ready for the invasion of Normandy, of Europe. His mission order, the order that was given to him by the president, by Roosevelt, it said, quote unquote, you are to enter the continent of Europe and destroy the German army. That was the strategy. And the belief was that if the German army was destroyed, that the will to fight of the German people would be destroyed along with it. So that's kind of the way the U.S. looks at this. It's the way that we are looking at things in the South China Sea now. We have our strategy of a deterrence strategy against China is denial. We want to deny the Chinese what it is they want. It's effectively a defensive strategy. The Chinese deterrence strategy is coercion. They will coerce people to do what they want, to two different ways of looking at it. The notion of deception here that I put down on there is the reason this is difficult is because we as a democracy have peacetime laws and rules about how we can deceive people. And it's especially now with the advent of the internet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very difficult to do that. Also, we are fighting with an alliance. And in order to keep an alliance together, it's necessary that there be some high level of transparency between all of the members of the alliance, that they all feel like they are part of that alliance. Right? So those things make it more difficult to deceive. And surprise, I would suggest, is only possible at the tactical level. One of the greatest deception campaigns in history was, if you read the book Operation Mincemeat, was about the Allies convincing the Germans that the landing at D-Day was going to be at the Pas-de-Calais, not at Normandy Beach, where it was. But that was a tactical level deception. And the fight is in the conventional military domain of battle space. That's where we are, where our focus is. And briefly, to sum this up, this is a comparison in terms of cognitive warfare about the way the U.S. and the PRC look at this. The Xi strategy of attacking the enemy's strategy, vice Li, which attacks the enemy's forces. The PRC, to the last question, which is a great one, who is the focus of effort here? The global war space. The Chinese have, in the last 18 months to 2 years, become extremely active in the social media campaigns, much more so than we've ever seen them before in the social media domain. And they are trying to exacerbate the discrepancies and the differences between political right and political left. They're trying to cause minorities in America to believe that no one cares about them. I mean, they're trying to take all of the fault lines in U.S. society and exacerbate them. We haven't seen them do that before. The Russians have been doing it for years, but generally not with the same sort of strategic focus. They've kind of done it by fits and starts. Again, deception to create cognitive uncertainty. We, on the other hand, in order to create stability in both the domestic public environment as well as in the allies, and to prevent a quote unquote a loss of control of a situation. We talked about this war space and battle space. There's a concept known as the OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, and act. It's captured many people in the U.S. National security realm, but it is a tactical concept that was designed by a fighter pilot named John Boyd, and it is not appropriate, nor is it effective at the strategic level. So again, you can see where we're kind of planning for a military fight and hoping that the adversary will be impressed by our military prowess and will surrender to what we want to do. The PRC is planning for a societal war, and that's just the kind of the best way that I can put that. So how does this whole thing, what is this, what does it look like? What is this thing, when we talk about conducting U.S. operations, what kinds of things could you do to reduce the confidence they have in their own war plans? So the Chinese look at the capabilities of the U.S. and they see our ability to command and control forces, large numbers of military forces over the entire Pacific domain as an extremely effective and as a great strength of ours. So what they do is that's why you see a lot of the Chinese anti-satellite capabilities that they're developing. Their cyber capabilities have just increased fivefold in the last 10 years, from being focused on just stealing intellectual property to actively trying to change and alter perceptions, and to put down or to put implants and things into U.S. infrastructure. Okay, so it's not just that we have to defend the military networks. It's that you have to defend the infrastructure that's at home as well, because the Chinese, again, are fighting a societal war. When I talk about the U.S. needing to identify both red and blue targets, what I mean by that is that you identify the targets that the enemy has, right? That the enemy targets that you think are going to be, that need to be attacked in order for you to be effective. But at the same time, you need to look at yourself and to look at the targets that the enemy might come after us with his strategy. And the danger here is what's called mirror imaging, where you tend to look at the adversary as if you were looking at yourself in a mirror. Now, for many, many years against the Soviet Union, we kind of sort of got away with that because the Soviet Union was more Western than it was Eastern. And the people kind of looked like us, kind of thought like us, kind of talked like us in a different language. But I would suggest that the Chinese culture, the Chinese, their worldview is so very different that if we tried to mirror image them, it would be, we would do that at our peril. The targets can be physical. They can be not physical, obviously. They can be mentally tangible things, ideas that you can't get your hands on or that you can wrap your head around. You want to get the adversary thinking about this notion that, for example, that China has been put down by Westerners since the Boxer Rebellion in the early 20th century, and that China needs to take its rightful place in the world, and its rightful place in the world is not as a peer of the United States, but supplanting the United States as the one true world power. I mean, this is what they say. This is what Xi says. This is what's in all their open press. We shouldn't not believe them. I mean, this is what they believe, and they believe that they are ultimately going to prevail over the United States, and they're going to do that in a number of ways. If you look at for instance, in the nuclear facility, the capabilities that the Chinese are building, it's been twofold in the last 10 years. So and we don't have a theory of mutual destruction with the Chinese. In other words, with the Russians, we both kind of tacitly agreed that if we started shooting at each other, we were going to destroy each other. We don't have anything like that with the Chinese. We don't even have a hotline with them. So that's one of the things that we need to think about. The preconceptions that the PRC holds about the U.S., that we don't have the will to confront the Chinese, is something that needs to be considered. This notion of left and right of boom. So the expression left of boom means that things you would do prior to a conflict, and right of boom are things you would do in the conflict itself and continuing past. Again, it has to do with the fact that we, the U.S., have a fairly linear way of planning for wars and of trying to execute them. We start at the beginning, we build up forces, we gain all this intelligence, we go and have this short, very violent military action. The enemy sees that he has no choice and no chance to survive and throws up his hands and surrenders. And then we go back to the way things were before. Chinese, that's not the case at all. And they don't have that view, that historical view. So as we think about how we're going to attack the perceptions we want the PRC to hold about the U.S., we need to have a much deeper understanding of their culture and of their worldview and how they came to that, if you will. And the last thing is, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, a couple questions in I think maybe it's time to interject here real quick where you are. Let me start off with the one that I put on hold a while ago because I think it fits here. The question is, in your opinion, should the U.S. add a cognitive domain to the traditional 5 domains, knowing that it can conflict with democratic values since it relies on tactics like disinformation, propaganda, psychological warfare, and deception?
Well, oh boy. So that's a great question, and it's kind of the $1 million question. It is much more difficult for a democracy like ours to conduct what we would consider cognitive warfare, simply because of the way the openness of the government, et cetera, et cetera. But I would suggest that we have done it in the past. If any of you get a chance to read, there's a gentleman named George Kennan, right? George Kennan was in the late 1940s, was a State Department officer in Moscow, and he wrote what is known as the Long Telegram. And the Long Telegram was his observations of the Soviet Union and what he thought the Soviet Union was trying to do and how we, the U.S., ought to try to deal with that, to mitigate that. That Long Telegram became later on what's known as National Security Concept, the NSC 68, which was our sort of model, if you will, our plan for the Cold War. Kennan, though, also wrote something that I think you would really enjoy, and he wrote a short treatise on something he called political warfare, and where he made the case that the State Department needed to do things like Radio Free Europe, that they needed to present the Russians with a propaganda, not in a bad way, but that they had to respond to, and to try to attack the regime through those kinds of methods. And it was arguably one of the very successful things that we did do that caused the Soviet Union eventually to come undone, as more and more of the people in what was then Czechoslovakia in 1968, Hungary in 1956, and other places began to have literally revolutions until ultimately the wall was going to come down. But a lot of that had to do with the fact that we had a very aggressive program to combat the Soviet ideas and what it was they were saying. And again, it was done with almost with a sort of a marketing mentality, and understanding that the facts really are not important. I mean, they are, but they aren't. What's really important is how you give people a way to interpret the facts in a way that is beneficial to your particular view.
All right, so
If
Bob,
you
I'm gonna
just-
make it, so next question actually fast forwards from that time period, and that's the right answer. That's a really good answer. I think it's really, you know, we've done this before, so there's nothing really necessarily anti-democratic or that we necessarily couldn't get away with. But another question comes in that's kind of targeted more at a contemporary aspect of this, which is successful and targeted cognitive warfare relies on big data. How pivotal is it for the U.S. to enact federal as well as cross-border data sharing privacy legislation to mitigate cognitive warfare efforts? China already has several national data sharing laws, for example, data localization, as well as the EU. Does the U.S. need to pursue something like that in order to combat cognitive, the cognitive warfare being conducted against it?
Well, I don't know. So the data, so interestingly enough, there's a lot of discussion about the extent to which the data plays an important role in this. Again, from the readings, from what the Chinese are writing in the open press, which we believe to be what they're using to inform their development of their capabilities, they're saying that their view of cognitive warfare is that it is not about manipulating data. They are happy to leave the data undisturbed while they change the context in which we view the data. Now, I guess you'd probably have to spend some time thinking about how you would change the context in which one views data. In other words, how you go beyond the facts of something and you begin to change the way people look at a government. For example, in the Soviet Union, the political warfare was not necessarily designed to take down the Soviet Union, although we would have been happy to have had that happen. As you can tell, when it finally did happen, what we were missing was a plan to deal with that. So the data construct now. All right, so let's talk about that for a minute. So the U.S., our focus right now is on protecting the integrity of data, right? So one of the things that I had experimented with when I was at Cyber Command was we had a way when I booted up a computer every morning and I turned in one of my classified computers, there was a display that would come up and tell me whether or not any of the data in the databases that I was accessing had changed since I had logged off. It didn't tell me whether it was good or bad. It just said there's been an addition or a subtraction or a change in data. That in and of itself was enough to get me thinking about that. And about what that could mean. And it was a way of us trying to sort of preserve the integrity of the decision process, because we thought as long as we have all the data that we need and the data is undisturbed and it's pure and it tells us what is happening on the ground, we could make the kind of decisions that would be necessary to exploit that data. But I think what we were missing and still missing is this fundamental notion of context manipulation. So one of the best ways to see this is if you study surprise as a military tool, right? And you look at the surprise, whether it was at the German invasion of the Soviet Union, whether it was the Yom Kippur War in 1973, you find that all of those surprise attacks, and or you could even argue that what the Israelis are dealing with right now in Gaza, they all began with a surprise. And in the case of the Yom Kippur War, there's been a lot written about this from the Israeli perspective, and the leadership of Israel, to their great credit, absolutely agrees that they did not see they did not correctly interpret the data because of their conceptions about the Arabs' ability to fight, about the dominance of the Israeli Defense Forces, and other things. So you find that in the case of the Germans in Operation Barbarossa, Stalin, actually, the Russians had a spy in the Japanese embassy, Tokyo. His nickname was Sword, and he actually had seen the war plans and knew when it was going to happen. And Stalin's his answer when they came in to brief him on this is, well, I just don't trust spies anyway. Okay, so what that tells you is that the data is important, but the data is only important if it leads to a way for us to make a decision that is going to be effective. And that's why that last bullet, it talks about measures of effectiveness. If I'm going to try to change the way the PRC is behaving, I need to have some measures that I can use to evaluate that change so that I know whether or not I'm having the effect that I want. But the question about data, though, is a very, very good one, and it's something that I would encourage you to read about surprises. If you read about our own history of Pearl Harbor, you will see, and again, I understand a lot of this is 2020 hindsight, but you will see that the way we interpret certain data, certain things, is a measure of the worldview that we have and the perceptions that we have and the sort of the filters that we use to evaluate and to establish that. Is another example. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy established what he called the ExComm, the Executive Committee. And it was a small group, the chairman and a number of other very influential Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, those kind of folks. And Bobby Kennedy, who was his younger brother, who was the Attorney General. And they were talking about what to do about the missile sites that they had already seen established in Cuba. And one of the options on the table was that they were going to bomb them. And at one point in his conversation, Bobby Kennedy raises his voice and says, "We can't do that. That would be like Pearl Harbor." Well, it would be nothing like Pearl Harbor, but that one sentence, they literally took that off the table and it was never discussed again. And that was because of the way that changed the perception that they all had about what we were doing. And the US didn't want to be accused of being the ones to make a quote sneak attack, unquote. So the last chart that I've got here is in the course of this 2-year research piece that we did. One of the things that the folks that gave us a grant wanted to know at the end is, so how do we develop U.S. capabilities? What kind of capabilities do we need in the United States? And this is an example of some of them. I would tell you that from a big picture standpoint, what we need people that are psychologists, cultural anthropologists, and sociologists to be involved in the creation of a counter-China strategy. You just have to have those kinds of folks that understand how you manipulate context to change the way people view, see you. These are just some examples about doing this. One of the questions that came up a couple of years ago that I was asked when I was up at Cyber Command is, what could we do anything to defeat the Great Firewall of China and just open it up and let the Chinese see everything that there is to see? And my answer was twofold. One is that there are a large number of people in China that know how to do that anyway. And the second part of it is, to what end? What is it that you're wanting to do by Do you want them, following, somebody on Facebook? Do you want them? What is it you're trying to do to create these new sorts of perceptions? What the Chinese understand about social media in particular is they're very aware of the way the Facebook algorithm, news algorithm works, right? And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but you click on Facebook News. If you click on a site, depending on what it is, it's 3 to 4 times, maybe 5. You will never see anything again that doesn't comport with what was on that site. In other words, with what your worldview is. So all the news you get is always going to be influenced by the particular perception you have of whether you think the government's good or bad, whether you like the economy, whether you don't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, these are all ways that we can think about doing that and understanding what the limits are of technology, and that at the end of the day, like I said, technology influences, but it does not determine the effectiveness of changing perceptions of conflict, of warfare in this particular domain. And the point about actions and behaviors, again, the language itself, the narrative itself is necessary, but it is not sufficient. You have to be able to see how that changes in actions and in actions and in behaviors to have an idea of what the society truly believes. And this is the other classic example of this, if you look at it, is the way what people tell to folks that are polling and what they actually do when they go to the polls to vote. And in the last couple of elections, we've seen that those two things can be very different. So these are the kinds of capabilities. What I didn't talk about tonight, and what the rest of the study is about, but it's in much more detail, is about organizational changes in the U.S. government structure that might make it more effective for us to counter the malign influences of the Chinese. But ultimately, this cognitive warfare piece is more about it's about will. It's about all the things that we fundamentally know about warfare. What is different now is the scope and scale that technology allows you to use to get to a larger number of people in a much shorter period of time. And if you can think about this, Benito Mussolini, who was the first fascist to be elected in the 1930s, or the 20s actually, before Hitler, he said that he contributed a lot of his rise in Italy to the wireless radio, because now he could give a speech and hundreds of thousands of people could hear him at the same time. Prior to that, you gave a speech and the only people that heard you right away were those that were in the venue, and then they would go tell somebody else what they had heard, and it may or may not have had this strong of a message. So you think about how that's changed 100-fold now with the advent of the internet. So technology clearly plays a role, but it needs to be we need to understand its role. It's not determining, but influencing what cognitive warfare can do.
So a really thoughtful question in the question and answer block about one of the distinctions between kind of the U.S. view on war and the Chinese view on war. The question says, how does cognitive warfare complicate the act of going to war, just ad bellum, since it is about perceptions and less about kinetic operations? For example, can the U.S. determine now that China is using cognitive warfare on it, and therefore we're in a state of war?
That's a good question. So the Chinese don't.
Are we having a language problem? I think I argue in my when I taught 501 that we have a language problem, right? Because when we call it a war, that means, well, it's the Department of Defense and it's a war, and now certain rules apply. But are we at war?
Well, so that's a great question. So we wrestled with this and still do in the cyber domain all the time, but the important thing is that our adversaries don't make any distinction between that we do. They are conducting operations now against the United States in the cyber world and the cognitive domain that are it would comport with them being at war. To them, it's just the state of things. That it's a very I would suggest kind of an outdated notion that there are that there is this nice fine line between being at war and not being at war. And a lot of that is context dependent. You know, the night that we started Desert Storm, when we started the bombing, I was leading the first strike that went north that night. But as we were rolling down a runway, I can remember plugging in the afterburners. It was pitch black. We didn't have night vision goggles or anything, and you could boom, boom, and off they went. And we went charging down there. And I thought to myself, wow, we're really going to do this. We're really going to start the war. Everything's going to change. And it kind of did for about 3 months. And then it kind of didn't. So that we like to think there's a nice fine line, but it's difficult to see that. Another thing that the PLA Daily they had a field day with us a year ago. They published they had a picture that was taken off of a social media page, a Facebook page, of a Navy captain of a ship who was a commander, and he was sitting in his chair on the bridge, and there was a Chinese vessel, a Chinese destroyer that was on the horizon that you could see coming by, and this Navy captain, was sitting there, and he had his feet up on the rails, and he was showing the soles of his feet to the Chinese. And they accused the United States of conducting cognitive warfare, because that was the most disrespectful thing that you could possibly do to the Chinese. So your question's a good one. During the Cold War, we had a concept, the Cold War, a war that wasn't hot, but we were at war with the Soviet Union.
Right.
We don't have that right now. And
yeah, that's interesting.
Maybe it's time that we did.
When it comes, and again, here we have a language issue, right? Because another question from the Q&A block says the president recently said, following his meeting with Xi in San Francisco, is that the U.S. will continue to compete vigorously with the PRC. Is China our competitor or our adversary? And do the words matter?
Well, the words do matter, and I think that the reason that the administration views them as a competitor is because they are kind of sort of soft stepping around this. Because if you look at the narrative that's coming out of the Pentagon, there's no competitor in it. I mean, they're the adversary, they're it. And so you've got the president saying, well, we're competing with China, and I suppose at one level we surely are. And then you've got the Pentagon saying that they are a peer competitor and they are the existential threat to the United States. I think that we are competing with them in the sense that we ultimately want to win this thing, whatever that means. I think that the people that are trying to sort this out still have this notion of the Cold War in mind, that we competed with the Russians for all these years, and then the Russians, then their system fell apart, and so we, quote, won the Cold War. But as we all know, winning and losing are two very relative terms, shall we say.
Clausewitz, which says that no result in war is ever final, right? And that's kind of what we've certainly found out after the end of the Cold War. There's a perception, and I know that several secretaries of defense have made comments very similar too. Although things may be a little bit different under this administration. One of the attendees in the audience asked the question: why has the U.S. Department of State been relegated by so many presidential administrations to a lagging influence in foreign policy, and why haven't they're more promoted to a first-line bulwark of U.S. advocacy for Western liberalism? Because they actually played that role, right? More so, certainly in Kennan's time. The state government had a much more forward role, and they have been relegated since Korea, or actually since McCarthyism, actually. But that's a different story.
So the demise of the influence of the State Department actually begins in the 1970s. And it begins when a number of Southern senators rise in stature to become in charge of the committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate and Armed Services Committee, and they are very concerned about what they consider to be an undue influence of the sort of liberal educated side of the United States in the State Department. that their worldview is globalists and is not doesn't comport with what they believe. The other problem is challenges. In the 1950s, the State Department became a target for a lot of the McCarthy hearings, and they were going after the quote communists. I mean, George Marshall, one of the absolute heroes of this country, was a Secretary of State, was accused of being a communist. I mean, it was that silly. So what happens is they begin to take money from the State Department in the 70s, and the money goes into this Department of Defense, because the Department of Defense can change and do things very quickly. Then in the 1980s, we begin to create and begin to fund what were then known as SINCs, but they're now known as combatant commands. And the combatant commander became sort of what's the word I'm looking for, kind of a pro-counsel in the region of the world that he was in. And there's no better explanation of this or example of this than in the late 90s. There was a Washington Post correspondent named Dana Priest, who was writing an article about Tony Zinni. Tony Zinni was the commander of Central Command at the time. She was traveling with him, and he was the ambassador was with them from Pakistan. And Musharraf it had been a coup, and Musharraf had taken over. And when he didn't call the State Department. The person he called to talk to was General Zinni, to tell him, look, I've just taken over. I'm in charge of Pakistan. It's going to be okay. And that was a long time in coming. One of the other challenges is that the State Department, we have ambassadors in countries, whereas the combatant commander has a whole region of countries that he is in charge of, and he has money and he has forces that can do things and change things. And even when, for example, and this is these people as different as Secretary of Defense Gates and Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, they both tried at various times to transfer money from the Department of Defense to the Department of State. And they both gave the same reasons publicly. We're going to have to wind up killing these people if we can't figure out how the State Department is going to do what they're going to do. Then we're going to call in the military, and we're going to have to go in there and break all this glass. That's the notion, and it's an absolute shame that it happened that way. But it is partially it's because of our committee system that we have in the Congress and how we fund things, and that's the way that you influence policy. You can have a grad school seminar forever, but if you take their money away, there's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, that's and once you've funded them, you've created vested interests that are going to very, very much well-resourced interests that become very difficult to overturn. I want to get to one last question. I'd like to keep this in an hour, Professor Schmidle, and so I respect your time and the time of our audience. But there is one last question I want to get to, because it's from a very important audience from actually out, and I want to take this perspective and have you respond to it. First of all, the student says, thanks for your lecture. You mentioned the public medias, the social medias like Facebook, but in PRC, there's no way to use Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube because of the firewall. Do you think this is part of cognitive warfare? And what do you think the US can do to deal with that question? How do we, again, kind of goes around, how do we get around the firewall to do cognitive warfare in China if we don't have access to them?
Well, let's assume that you could have access to that. Let's just make that assumption and then create a strategy that would support that. Right now, the companies like Amazon and Google voluntarily submit to Chinese censorship and Microsoft. I mean, it's just the companies have gotten to the point where they are dealing with them. They are accepting their the constraints and restrictions that the government of China puts on them. I believe it was Twitter that recently had the same, that somebody outed them because it turns out that they were allowing the Indian government to restrict reporting on some of the militants and insurgents. So that's already happening in the case of U.S. companies that have just decided that they were going to do that because it's good for their company. The question that you might struggle with here is, how do you deal with corporations like Amazon's and Google's and Microsoft's that view themselves, or Elon Musk, as sovereign countries, nations? I mean, where is their allegiance? Who is their allegiance to? And do they, we're having this big discussion now about startups and venture capital firms, and you don't have to kick over too many rocks to see that in some cases, some of the bigger ones have taken investment money from China. So how do you deal with that? So we're getting money from the Chinese to invest in venture capital firms to create capabilities that we're trying to use against the Chinese. And how do you think that's going to work out? Mm-hmm. There are little lights in the forest. Those of you that went to see the movie Top Gun Maverick, a couple of things. First of all, I wasn't number 3 in that flight. I actually led it, and there was only 2 of us. And it's a story for another day. And the weather was not that good, and it was in the mountains of another country. But at any rate, but one of the things that the Chinese investors in that movie were irate about, and actually threatened to pull all their money, and God bless them, Tom Cruise told them go ahead and do it. If you'll notice, one of the scenes in there, he's wearing a flight jacket that has a Taiwanese flag on it, and that got him going. That got the Chinese all spun into orbit. So they, again, I'm sure they were accusing us of cognitive warfare, but I personally thought that was rather appropriate. It's kind of cool. But yeah,
interesting. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna let you go, Professor Schmidle. Thank you so much for your time. Really good questions from the audience. I looked through the list of audience members, and I know so many of them, and I appreciate them coming. It was an excellent presentation, and we appreciate your time very much. Professor Schmidle teaches cybersecurity strategy and planning in the spring, and then in the fall, summer and fall, he teaches an overview of cybersecurity. So please take a look at his course. The cybersecurity planning and strategy course does require a prereq. You have to take 560 in order to get into 563, but I think everyone in the MA program should take 560, just because I think the overview of cybersecurity is something you cannot not understand if you want to understand security. In any case, thank you all for coming, and please join us in the spring when we relaunch our MAGS faculty speaker series again in the spring. Good night, all.